Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Adventures of Tintin from 2011. I'm not entirely sure where I should start with this film because it's a little weird. This is a movie that I forgot existed, and when realizing that it came out in 2011 and realizing how long ago that was kind of rocked me a little. This movie was not really on my radar again, except for a friend who was like, oh yeah, we should watch this. And I was like, oh yeah, that movie exists. And it's a movie that I was always curious about for a variety of reasons, but never really wanted to watch. Tintin is a property that has a very special place in my heart. But it's not a property that most Americans or most of like the English speaking world in general knows very much about. Tintin is a comic slash like graphic novel series from like the 1920s and 1930s that was originally came out of Belgium. And it's, for a variety of reasons, didn't make the transition to a lot of English-speaking media for a while. And also, some of it has been, like, semi-lost to time, in part because it was sort of comics in the 30s were disposable things. And the attitude towards it as an art form was a different kind of thing at that time, but also because some of it has deliberately not been republished, even though ownership rights still lay in someone's hands somewhere, because some of it has not aged super well. No surprise, Belgium in the 30s has some slightly different cultural attitudes than modern times or even recent times. So Tintin is not a property that came to the English-speaking world all that much. And so when they originally announced it and said, we're making a Tintin movie, and it's being directed by Steven Spielberg, that kind of fascinated me on its own, like on the idea alone. Now, as I understand it, some of the people associated with this, including Steven Spielberg and Edgar Wright and Peter Jackson, all pretty substantial names in addition to some others, were various fans of Tintin as a property and were part of the reason why this got produced in the first place. And I think Spielberg had owned the rights or something like that to make a movie adaptation for a while. Anyway, that's not as important as what they actually made, which is basically an amalgamation of a couple of the again, I don't know what to call them because graphic novel would not be the term at the time they were published or even, 50 years ago. Yes, these books are almost 100 years old. Sorry. So having, as a fan of Tintin myself and somebody who used to read them, borrow them from my local library and read them there because somebody who was who worked for or donated to my local library was a big fan of them, and so we had a collection of them. I read basically all of them, with a few exceptions, mostly being the ones that are out of print. And so I recognized a lot of the plot beats in this movie as they were happening. I also recognized a lot of the hooks that were like set up right at the beginning of like, oh, which narrative is this? Those sorts of things. It also admittedly makes me biased, not only because I have certain expectations, knowing those stories very well, even though I haven't read them in 20 years, but for what things should look like, what the tone should be like. And I think it's perfectly fair, if not entirely, it is not the sole way to critique an adaptation, but I think it is an important version of critiquing an adaptation, to critique in context of its original property. So this movie adapts like content from like 3 of the graphic novels, and each of them are like about 40, 50, 60 pages each, depending on which one it was. And they move at a pretty fast clip. They're not like hanging around, not getting anything done in that amount of time. They're full-fledged stories, if like reasonably simple ones, within the length of their full run. And a lot of the graphic novels sort of run into each other, where they give you either a hook or the next one is like a real, like a continuation of the previous story. So making a couple of these into a single movie kind of makes sense. However, in the adaptation process, I think this movie lost a lot. And it lost it in a variety of different places. I think the first thing we need to talk about is the graphics. This movie is 2011 CGI, and at the time, and even now, people give it a lot of praise for being graphically spectacular. And I can't deny that that is true. Even now, and some of it has aged a little bit questionably, but even now, visually, it's extremely impressive. It is the use of color, light and darkness, 3D screen space, all these other things, seems to genuinely leverage the medium extremely well. However, and this is a big however, I really do not like some of the stylistic choices they made. And the 2 main ones are in the camera work and in the visual designs. And that's mostly to do with the people. So the original comics are relatively, they vary between relatively simplistic designs and extremely detailed ones. Hergé's artwork, I think that's how you pronounce his name, was very flat, but could be very detailed, and especially in larger pictures. Sometimes he would do full page spreads that was just a wide shot of a whole room or something like that with intense detail in it. It was always very clear in its art style what you were looking at. And the detail was there to add detail, not to add flourish. So you had characters who had very simple designs. You could draw Tintin's head in like 5 pen strokes. It is one of and it is incredible, an incredibly iconic face. So I don't know how to do this without talking in circles about the style of Tintin's original art and why it works so well. I'm gonna try and simplify it. You get an intense amount of detail and also a lot of characterization from relatively simple changes in the art in the original novels. All of the characters have incredibly expressive faces, despite the fact that most of them are drawn with eyes that are just dots and mouths that are like relatively simple, sometimes just like a circle, all these other things. The stylist, like some characters straight up don't have mouths, like at any point in the entire run of the comic. And yet they have such expressiveness that it kind of sets an unreasonable bar for what you might end up doing in an adaptation. Now, as I understand it, I didn't realize this until I was looking into this, or finding out about it as we were going to watch it. I didn't realize there are some other adaptations that happened some time ago, I think there was a TV adaptation in the 60s and then also one more recently. And I think at least one of them appears to have tried to mimic the original comic art style, which I think is really fascinating. I may have to delve into at some other time just because I like that better, frankly. And I'm losing the plot here. My point is that when you adapt it to an entirely different medium and an entirely different art style, you have to be careful what you do. And especially when you're working with something that has deliberately low detail in it, turning it into a high fidelity 3D medium is going to be controversial at best. Now, for people who have no attachment to Tintin, that being most of the movie-going audience who would have seen this in the English-speaking world, it may not bother them as much. But I still think it's going to bother them, because there's an aspect of this which is, I don't like the stylistic choices they made. And there's a bigger aspect of this of, some of these people are kind of nightmarish to look at. And even worse is that, and the main issue is in people's bodies and faces. The movie cannot decide what style it's going to go for. And this is especially notable when you have certain characters face to face with each other or very near each other in the same shot, where you're like, these two characters do not appear to be from the same medium at all. Because one of them looks very close to human, like borderline photorealistic, and the one next to him looks like somebody put like a photorealism filter on a cartoon character, and it looks upsetting. And that isn't to say they couldn't have gone either way with this. And frankly, I would have preferred they kept it more cartoony. And I don't even think that's necessarily just because I have such a love for the originals. I think they could have gone with a very different cartoony style that doesn't look anything like the original media, and it would have been fine. But because this, to some extent, is a tech demo as well of what they were capable of with the 3D renderings at the time, it tries to go for a level of photorealism, even with relatively cartoony characters, that falls deeply into the uncanny valley. Now, is this as bad as the all-time winner of worst Uncanny Valley 3D, that being Polar Express? No, it's not anything near that bad. But it definitely has a whiff of Polar Express going on. And if you can even put two movies in the same sentence and one of them is Polar Express, you're probably not making a favorable comparison. There are other problems stylistically that aren't just the faces. Bodies and proportions are sort of off all over the place. And sometimes it's because, I think sometimes it's because they were trying to mimic the cartoony style of the original, but with photorealism, and they didn't quite work out where to find that balance correctly. But credit where it is due, everything that is produced very well. And I'm going to talk now a little bit about the acting, because I think it deserves credit that the work that is done in motion capture is extremely good. Now, I'm going to give all the credit on that part of it to Peter Jackson and the people that he probably brought into this project, because obviously Peter Jackson and Weta Workshop and a couple of these other companies that he's worked with a lot, that he may or may not be directly involved in, have been sort of at the forefront of this like digital space for a long time, sort of after Industrial Light and Magic sort of took a dive a little bit. I don't want to get too far into the like history of special effects studios and things like that, but some of the production on that is really good, and I think that the motion capture stuff was a good choice and is probably entirely down to Peter Jackson's contributions and so on. Now, the other part I was going to talk about that I'm now going to shorten up because this video is already going to go long, is that I really do not like some of the camera work. Because this is not unique to this property, but it is a very big problem in this movie, is that when working in fully 3D spaces, movie makers do not seem to have understood what is a good and bad decision when it comes to camera movement. And even some talented directors, when given the helm of a 3D property, seem to completely forget some of the fundamentals of camera work. And the fundamentals of camera work and of cinematography are sometimes they're stylistic. Sometimes they're stylistic. But more often than not, they are for the sake of visual consistency and storytelling consistency. There are rules about how you, air quotes, rules about how you move a camera, because if you move it too erratically, if you stitch together shots, this is in terms of live action stuff, if you edit in a way where your camera moves too much and gets too weird, the movie-going audience starts to lose track of where they are, and the camera starts becoming a character unto itself, and usually not in a good way. Now, it can be used deliberately that way for stylistic reasons. And that's not to say that all the camera work in this movie is a problem, but there is a lot of it that is. And that gets into a pacing issue, which is probably my biggest complaint in this film. This movie has no pacing, and its tone is all over the place. And this video is now going to explode because I have to talk about like a bunch of things all at the same time. This movie lost tone-wise entirely what Tintin, the original Tintin, was all like. Tintin tonally is a mystery detective series with a lot of comedy in it. To the point of, I would say, calling it slapstick comedy without the intention of being like laugh out loud slapstick. It's more like slapstick hijinks to sort of characterize the actions of the characters, the actions of various characters, and what they are and aren't capable of, and also to drive certain elements of the plot. And this movie lost that entirely. It is extremely self-serious with only a sprinkling of comedy, none of which I think works particularly well. But what's even worse is that the movie has no pacing because it seems extremely overeager to just get to the next action scene, of which there are many in this film. I would say 70% of this film is just non-stop camera movement following an action scene. And I feel like it's obvious, it goes without saying, that a comic from the 30s is not an action, like, it's not an action comic. This basically predates like superheroes. Entirely as a concept almost. And the idea of action in a long form comic with some pretty standard framing just sort of fundamentally wouldn't have happened at that time at all. And that's not to say that the series is without action. It has it, but it uses it sparingly because the media doesn't necessarily lend itself to that. This movie feels like it forgot that 60s, 60%, 70% of Tintin, the original series, is about characters discussing things, investigating things, doing detective work. And then it's like 20-30% running around shooting guns, having laughs, doing slapstick fist fights and things like that. This movie lost the plot when it decided it wanted to get an Oscar. And I say that half joking, because this did get a lot of awards for its production, but that doesn't make for a good narrative. It is so focused on showing what it is visually capable of when it is at its most spectacular. And sometimes that can be quite good, but it sacrifices the rest of the movie as a result. It sacrifices the rest of the narrative. It sacrifices character development. It sacrifices narrative consistency, because basically the 30% that isn't action scenes is just there to string you from one action scene to the next. When a scene ends, they stitch in a little bit of narrative for maybe 5 minutes so that it has an excuse for you to do another over-the-top chase or gunfight or fist fight where the camera just swings around like crazy. And frankly, I was just bored. Because the scenes are long and there are too many of them. So, as a result, you end up with this movie that doesn't have strong character development, does substantial rewrites as well of the original series, even though the original series is arguably a simpler narrative. And the movie over explains. It spends an inordinate amount of time introducing and explaining various characters that, in the context of the original Tintin, like, you can read them out of order, by the way. The original books, you can read them completely out of order, and by context clues and alone, like, none of the characters have to be explained. You sort of like, oh, this character is this character is that. They know each other. They're having a conversation now. Like, everything is pretty self-evident. So that it spends so much of its relatively short narrative time doing basically introductions while not actually doing anything meaningful in terms of character development, really hurts me, because that's so much what the original property was good at. I really want to like this, because certain elements of it I think are pretty great, to the point that I would even still, despite giving it so many negatives right now, probably be interested in seeing a sequel, because it does set itself up for a sequel, because there are a bunch more books that they could have pulled from that would follow directly on this story. But I just wish they hadn't Hollywoodized it so hard that it is full of sort of over artistry. I don't even know how to refer to this. The sum of all these parts here is so much less than the individual parts that's really where the disappointment is. Even if I wasn't a fan of Tintin, even if I didn't have the same sort of expectations, one last thing about the tone, because I just remembered it again. I can't tell who tonally this is for, because the beginning of the movie seems to be targeted at kids, at children. Structurally, it is very in your face about telling you what's going on, and visually seems to be targeted at a young audience as well as in its writing style. And then it has a series of gunfights and chases where people get shot and die, and you see like bloody holes, and even the original Tintin, when some of these same events happened, like somebody gets shot and you don't see anything. It's just like a car goes by and you see bang bang, like as a sound effect bubble, and then like somebody keels over. There's no blood or anything like that, or well, there are in some of them, but not in others. And like, I don't know if this is targeted at kids, then I don't know why they showed all that they showed. And if it's targeted at adults, then it deserved a much more mature narrative, and one that wasn't so fixated on making action scene after action scene, which is incredibly exhausting to most adult viewers, but obviously appeals to child viewers because they have a short attention span. They constantly need like sort of changes. That's a development thing that that I've talked about when talking about kids movies before, and how they tend to derail because they are constantly trying to keep the attention of children, who have a different sort of processing of what's on screen. Anyway, I'm digressing too much about this film, because it bothers me, because it's so close to good, because there's like elements that I really like. I even like some of the character designs and adaptations, and then just in the contrasts, in the juxtaposition, in the comparison, they fall apart. They look ugly. They look weird. And the more I think about this film, the more it bothers me. Do I have anything else to say? I guess I credit where it's due to a lot of the production value, as well as music by John Williams. Always a banger, never misses. John Williams will live on forever because his music is impeccable, no matter what he's composing it for. I guess I should have guessed when Steven Spielberg was the director, and with production including people like Kathleen Kennedy, that this was going to be a shit show, but I didn't know any of that going into it. I'm only finding it out after the fact. I wanted this to be better, and it's just kind of a mess. If it seems interesting to you, this is not a waste of your time. But if you love Tintin, or you really want to see what can be done in like a medium like this, I don't think this is anyone's best work. So it's more of a curiosity than it is a great film. Anyway, I'm going to stop before I digress too much further. Thank you all for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.